So I was watching Liam Triforce's video on Skyward Sword, and it's an amazing video, and if you haven't already, you should really check out his channel. He makes some really good shit. One part of his video that caught me off guard though was when he was talking about Skyward Sword HD. He overall praised the changes and improvements the re-release made for that game, but one criticism he gave was the lack of accessibility options for left-handed players. Since the Switch Joy-Cons both support gyro motion controls, Skyward Sword HD could have theoretically had a mode where you could swing the sword with the left Joy-Con for left-handed players. This criticism left me quite perplexed, as I am a left-handed person, and I could not disagree more with his assertion. This got me spiraling into various thoughts on the dynamic of gaming between left and right-handed players, and I wanted to kind of explore some of them in this open discussion style video. So by all means, from here, what I say are my thoughts and my thoughts alone, but I would love to read about what you guys might have to say in the comments. The first console I was actively aware of its upcoming launch was the Nintendo Wii. Before then, I was aware of all the main systems and handhelds that were circulating around the time. You know, the GameCube, Xbox, PS2, Game Boy Advance, and PSP. This also includes the Xbox 360, as by the time I really became aware of all the various game machines, the 360 already launched in 2005. So the Wii, in a way, was the first game system I had any anticipation for, although it wouldn't be until Christmas of 2007 when my family acquired one. I have a lot of siblings, and even though we all had our own personal game system, the deal for getting the Wii was that we would all have to share one. Though, one way or another, I convinced my parents to have the Wii hooked up into my room, as long as I let anyone play it at any time. Needless to say, that wouldn't really matter much since I played it all the time regardless. Anyway, I still remember the first game I ever tried for the system, a game that elicits a nostalgic feeling that no other game can. Of course, the game I am speaking of is Spider-Man 3. Now, this is a topic for another time, but to quickly explain, I really wanted to play this game and didn't have Mario Galaxy. Either way, I remember that before even starting the game, my older brother insisted to me that I held the Wii remote in my left hand and the nunchuck in my right. Since the Wii remote is obviously evocative of a standard television remote, I guess my brother thought I should hold the Wii remote on my left, since that's how I would usually hold a TV remote. Well, I can tell you with total honesty when I say that my memory is as clear as ever, as I recall the first 5 seconds of playing the game when I realized, holding the Wii remote in nunchuck like this is bullshit. For me, it was totally ass backwards. Like, sure, the Wiimote did feel natural in my hand for the most part, but fuck me, I was not going to try to use an analog stick with my right hand. I said fuck that, and held the Wii controllers like any normal person should. Any discomfort of pointing the Wii remote with my right was quickly outweighed by the familiarity of having movement controls on the left and action commands on the right. It was only recently have I begun to think about the logistics of that conclusion. If we look back to the earliest video game systems released, there's a plethora to choose from, but I do think it would be easy to simply use the Atari 2600 as the main example, since it's easily the most iconic console of its era. Looking at the controller, it's very straightforward. You would hold the joystick with your right hand, which mainly affected character positioning, and a single button that you would press with your left hand to perform various actions. Pretty self-explanatory, I know, but I wanted to emphasize it anyway since the next big iconic game system would do the complete opposite. The video game crash of 1983 would see the possible extinction of the video game market as we know it. The same year, a small little Japanese company you may have heard of called Nintendo would release the Famicom Disk System. Then, a few years later in 1985, would release the North American equivalent, the Nintendo Entertainment System, with these systems reviving the video game industry in a new renaissance that would only grow into what it is today as one of the biggest entertainment businesses of all time. Well, that's all well and good, but it all started with this new controller layout. Completely different from the Atari standard prior. Now we have a new input method, the D-pad, which replaced the joystick as a method for movement commands, now on the left side. And then we have 2 buttons for actions on the right side. This is the birth of the new standard on which game controllers would be designed going forward. Of course, I can only speak for myself and can't speak for every left-handed gamer out there, but I like to think we can all agree that this layout just makes sense. I first felt the discomfort of swapping control layouts when I tried to play a variety of Flash games on a computer. There existed many platformers, and I can tell you trying to move with the arrow keys on my right while jumping on my left was a very steep learning curve to tackle. Luckily, playing on a keyboard is quite different enough since your fingers do most of the work while your thumbs do the heavy lifting on a controller. But playing a Wii with the remote on the left, nunchuck on the right, was the last straw, and I could not adapt no matter how hard I tried. I may not be able to speak on behalf of all lefties, but every right-handed person I spoke to feels the same way, where movement on left, actions on right, makes the most sense and feels the most natural. Even now, I find that rather fascinating on an articulation standpoint. I mean, think about it. Character positioning is pretty damn important when playing a game, so logically you'd want to have the most control by using your dominant hand. Most people in the world are right-handed, and yet having movement functions on the left side just became the standard. When speaking to my right-handed friends about this, we came to the conclusion that simply because we were exposed to gaming at a young age, the hurdle of getting used to a game controller didn't really matter when factoring in dominant hands. Either way, we were all going to be playing games the same way, so we were all going to get used to it the same way. This brings me back to using the Wii for the first time, since the Wii challenges that conception by having motion controls. The ultimate conclusion I came to after pondering it for a while is that motion controls don't matter on which hand you use. Either way, it'll feel fine, and sure, despite preferring to use remotes with my left, using my right simply isn't going to make much of a difference. After all, most of the motion control functions on the Wii amounts to nothing more than just pointing at a screen and moving a cursor, in the same way that using a standard television remote on my right doesn't make a difference. Different actions, sure, but the same physical gesture regardless. And the articulation of wrist movements to move a cursor on a screen isn't complex enough for one hand to be preferred over the other. I stress again, I'm only speaking for myself on this matter, but I like to think this applies to most people too, right or left-handed. Even towards the most motion-heavy games on the Wii, the motion actions themselves aren't complicated enough for hand dominance to matter. This leads back to Skyward Sword, easily the most motion-based game for the Nintendo Wii. This game of course has the typical use of motion on the Wii by which of a cursor to aim, but this game as well tracks hand positioning to influence sword swings. I am using Skyward Sword HD for the Switch, but trust me when I say the Wii version is mostly the same way. As contentious as the motion sword controls in this game are, the fact of the matter is it's still not very complicated when you get right down to it. The game is designed for sword swings to only be registered in 8 directions. When swinging normally, the game does actually match your real-life movements rather accurately. However, when you're locked onto a target or simply holding the lock-on button down, which I stress is how you'll mostly be engaged with the sword controls, then the game restricts movements to only be in 8 directions. So, hand dominance once again fails to mean much, as the wrist movements required to adequately engage in the sword swings can be comfortably achieved on either hand. At least, that's how I feel as a lefty. So when thinking about Liam's critique of Skyward Sword HD not having accessibility options for left-handed players, I can only stress, as a lefty, that ultimately, it doesn't matter. Think about how Twilight Princess on the Wii flipped the entire game from the GameCube release so that Link would be right-handed, since that would better coincide with the fact that most players would be playing with the Wii remote in their right hand. Now I can't think of anyone, lefty or otherwise, crazy enough to actually play the Wii left-handed. Either way, this change was mostly seen, by right-handed people mind you, as a useless gesture, as A, the sword controls in Twilight Princess Wii amounted to nothing more than waggles replacing a button press, and B, the cognitive dissonance of a character's actions not corresponding to a player's actual movements just isn't that distracting. So for the case of Skyward Sword HD, let's say there were left-handed accessibility options, how would that have actually played out? Excluding the fact that Nintendo would never put in the work to redo animations to make Link left-handed, or even bothering to flip the game again just for an accessibility mode. If it did exist, I still wouldn't like it as a left-handed person. If Link was left-handed in this game, and the sword combat would be done with the left Joy-Con, I can only presume it would be extremely cumbersome to use. Since movement controls would still be relegated to the left analog stick, trying to juggle moving Link around while swinging the sword with the same controller sounds like a massive pain in the ass. And if the only other solution would be to have movement handled on the right analog stick, then it would be just like when I played the Wii for the first time with the nunchuck in my right hand. Absolute bullshit. All that for what? Being able to use my dominant wrist to swing a sword in 8 directions? Sorry, but no thanks. I mean, let's be real here, and other lefties, I hope you agree, but playing Wii games for so long with the Wiimote in my right hand has made it so now I actually prefer to have remotes in my right hand. Even for rail-style shooters that don't require an additional controller for movement, I still prefer to hold with my right as it feels the most natural at this point. Ultimately, it comes down to repetition, and even if the theoretical best setup for me would be to use my left hand, I'm more comfortable using my right in these applications as it's what I'm used to now. And I bet other lefties feel the same way. I don't mean to dunk on Liam's argument he makes 1,000 times better content than I do, but as far as what's a necessary accessibility option to add in games, I don't think appealing to left-handed players is worth it. This isn't just the Wii, this applies to older games too that have tried to appeal to a left-dominant audience, usually by which of having the right stick handle movement and the left stick handle the camera. If other lefties actually prefer that, then more power to you, but then fuck that trying to move a character and use the face buttons on the same side. That just isn't intuitive in my honest opinion. And if you ever catch me holding the N64 controller like this, then I kindly ask you to promptly put a bullet in my head. There is a case, however, where having left-handed accessibility actually mattered to me. It was something I never would have expected, and while I don't doubt practice would have gotten me used to it one way or another, it was the first time I actually preferred to use a left-handed mode. This occurred when I played Resident Evil 4 VR on the Oculus Quest 2, or MetaQuest 2. My VR experience before was digging around with Nintendo Labo. This thing is such a piece of shit, but I love it anyway. Only Nintendo could have gotten away with charging customers assloads of money for fucking cardboard. The real shocker though is that, deadass, this thing is actually really fun to use, and if you can get past the horrendous resolution on display and the juvenile production quality, then I say it's worth giving it a shot. Hey, it was fun enough for me to mostly use it for my second playthrough of Breath of the Wild since, you know, it's VR, and VR is pretty cool, man. Anyway, my first actual engagement into proper VR gaming was Resident Evil 4 VR. Resident Evil 4 is already one of my favorite games of all time, and this looked like such a cool and different way to play the game. The only other version that was just as unique was the release on Wii, which is still to this day my favorite way to play Resident Evil 4. It just goes to show that no matter how much you touch up the visuals or improve the performance, how the game is played is what matters most, and the motion control aiming in Resident Evil 4 Wii is stunningly more fun than the standard way on other releases. So having the game retooled in VR caught my attention something fierce, and while it's an exclusive on this rather unorthodox format, it otherwise would be totally worth it to drop $340 just to play it. As an actual VR game, it's rather bare bones to my understanding, as there are other VR games that go further overboard on how immersive they take it. Even still, once I tried to play this version with the normal settings tooled for right-handed players, I immediately felt the handicap. Long story short, aiming in VR is far more realistically handled than aiming on a flat 2D screen. Like I said before, on a 2D non-VR game, aiming amounts to nothing more complicated than pointing a remote on a screen, which is comfortable enough regardless of which hand you use. But in VR, it's basically like aiming in real life. And in that application, my aim with my right hand, my non-dominant hand, sucks ass. I tried to play through it thinking I could eventually get used to it, and I probably could if I was stubborn enough, but I ultimately switched the settings for left-handed players. Now all the weapons, sub-items, and such were relocated for left-handed function. And wow, what a difference it makes. Can an inconsistency be damned? I'm a left-handed Leon through and through. Truly, it was remarkable on how much better I felt being able to aim with my dominant left hand, something I had not yet felt before in my entire gaming life. It continues to be interesting since I believe all the left-handed settings do is move around where the weapons and items are located on your virtual in-game character model. If you wanted, you can still reach with your other hand and grab weapons and items that way. You have two virtual hands and a lot of freedom on how you hold the various tools. Changing left and right-handed settings does nothing else to my understanding. Actually, okay, I did notice that the bolt handle on the rifle is flipped depending on what hand dominance setting you have. I hadn't checked all the other weapons, but I'm sure similar adjustments were made. Actually, it's pretty funny. I was showing my friend Resident Evil 4 VR, and he was absolutely flabbergasted by the bolt handle placement, with the two of us unaware it was because of the left-handed setting. It's really cool, but in-game it's a little unwieldy to load another round. It can be done, but with how the game tracks hand placement, it can be pretty awkward to get a real feel for it. This led to me using the bolt handle with my right hand and not my left, which sure looks kind of stupid and puts me out of the scope every time, but being able to actually see what I'm doing is a worthwhile trade-off. So anyway, that's just a silly little topic I had a compulsion to share, and it all stemmed from a tick I felt of someone else vouching for my specific gaming needs as a left-handed person. As far as the discussion of accessibility options in games goes, I don't really have much to say other than the more options, the better. After all, gaming is already pretty alienating as it is. You put a controller in the hands of a non-gamer, and it'd be like trying to juggle Molotov cocktails blindfolded. So anything that can make a game as playable as possible for anyone is all good in my book. And if not, you can still usually rely on the tenacity of some people. I mean, fuck, there's a guy who plays Dark Souls with his chin, and is probably better at the game than you. But as far as appealing to left-handed people, I feel it's pointless for the most part, at least for me as a left-handed person. Only in VR was having a left-handed mode proved to be advantageous for me. I hope to dabble in other VR games in the future, but unfortunately it's such an expensive hobby. To be honest, the next VR game I'll play is probably the Resident Evil 4 remake on PSVR 2. Can't help that Resident Evil is one of my favorite franchises, and playing the various VR versions is a massive ass pain and financial sink. Gotta fucking get a PS4 and the original PSVR 2, and it's 1,000 cables for Resident Evil 7 VR, the Oculus Quest 2 for Resident Evil 4 VR, PSVR 2 for Resident Evil Village, and the Resident Evil 4 remake. I digress, and I should probably end it here before I have an aneurysm. I want to thank those for sticking with it to the end as I ramble on this admittedly uninteresting topic. After the last video, I just wanted something much shorter to do, and this felt like an appropriate project. I have a few ideas on what the next video might be, but I guess you'll just have to wait and see. I'm pretty sure that will be it for me today, so I just want to take the time and say thank you for watching.